A very bright Saturday morning here at the headquarters of Mugerwa Black Podcast. Well, welcome to yet again another great and interesting episode of the Mugerwa Black Podcast. Now, today is the 9th of July, Saturday, 2022. If you've been following keenly, then you know by now that we've already given you a teaser of what's coming up in the next few episodes, and we're just going to be continuing on those series. Today is episode 2 of the greatest of all time series. And just a brief background. This story was told by Rahman Ali. Rahman Ali was a brother to Muhammad Ali, who had, I think, roughly around 14 fights. He won a few of those, 7 I think, and he had like 4 knockouts. I am not sure what really happened, but yeah, you could actually go look him up. Rahman Ali was the name, and I'm just going to be reading his book, and the book is titled My Brother Muhammad Ali by Rahman Ali with Fiyaz Rafiq. So Rahman Ali writes this book, and I've already given you the brief background of the book itself, or what you could call the preface. And today we start with chapter 1, which is going to be very, very interesting to read. Now, I would like to say that I thank each and every one of you who is tuned in to this podcast. I would like to also condole each and every one of you who has lost a loved one, because I know what it means. I would also like to congratulate all of those who have succeeded or made it, or anything that you think was more valuable to you, anything that you feel was a win. And I'd like to also encourage those that are on their path, on their way to try and make it. Whatever their goals are, I would like to encourage you and tell you, please do not stop. There's light at the end of the tunnel, and I wish you all the luck. My brother almost killed our mum the day he was born. His head was gigantic as a newborn, far too big to sleep out naturally when mom was giving birth. The doctors at the General Hospital in Louisville, Kentucky, tried every trick in the book to ensure they delivered my brother into this world without losing him, and still almost didn't work. In the end, they resorted to using forceps, which caused Muhammad Ali to be born with lopsided head. Thankfully, our mom's own mother was there to console and help. Grandma assured mom that she would take care of her baby, and sat with my newborn brother, rubbing his head gently from side to side. Whether this played a role in the beautiful shape it eventually came to be, I can't say. But those forceps left a mark on my brother's right cheek that would stay with him his whole life. Otherwise, as our mom always told us, you could see from the day he was born just how good looking my brother would grow up to be. Those fine features that punches seemed to slip off, and the face that launched 1,000 newscasts, the one that almost everyone in the world would come to know. He was a beautiful boy from the first, and my mom loved him the instant she laid eyes on him. Still, not everyone recognized my big brother so readily. Shortly after the birth, the nurses put the wrong baby in our mother's bed, and mom, still in a haze from the stress of the delivery, only realized that this wasn't her little baby boy after reading the name tag. Even though she must have been in a panic, our softly spoken mom would have barely raised her voice to say, "Hey, this isn't my baby." She had a way of taking such indignities quietly, one of many respects in which she was the opposite of her father. Finally, they brought my brother to her. She told us years later that all the babies in the world were so quiet, you would have been hard-pressed to hear any of those little souls crying. Except, of course, for my brother, who wouldn't stop. He went off like a rocket, already the loudest in the room, and in less than 24 hours in the world. And of course, he eventually turned on the rest of the babies, and soon they had started screaming too. Only my brother could set the whole world off. Muhammad was loud from the day he was born. I thought of my older brother as Muhammad for the last 5.5 decades. But when he came to the world, our parents named him after my father. Cassius Clay Marcellus Sr. He was born on 17th January 1942, and I was born 18 months later. Our father was particularly fond of the Hollywood movie star Rudolph Valentino and decided to name me after him, Rudolph Arnett Clay. To my brother, though, I was always Rudy, and to me, the rest of the family, he was G, after his first words, Gigi, which he would use when he needed food, his diaper changed, or even just affection. In 1964, I would take the name Rahman when he took the name Muhammad. But people in the family still called him G, and do even now. Our father was Cash, and mom was Bird, inspired by the way she would burst into beautiful laughter when dad sang for her, or teased her, or told her jokes. Our mother was born Odessa Lee Grady on 12 February 1917. Her father, John Grady, was half white with black mother and a white Irish father. He had arrived in America in 1877 from a little town called Ennis in Ireland. After making the long and odious journey across the pond, he met and married a freed slave woman. Blessed with beauty inside and out, our mom had a very soft and gentle demeanor with a very framed body and a very light skin. She was easily mistaken for a white woman, even in those days when color was so important to your opportunities in life. Above everything else, you would be hard pressed to see our mother angry or upset. Always cheerful, mom had a kind of sparkle emanating from her that made her a very affable person. She constantly strove to treat others with dignity, imparted those same values to Muhammad and me as soon as we could speak. We were told to treat people with respect, kindness, to embrace good manners, and to respect our elders, regardless of their background. Without a shadow of a doubt, my brother inherited his sweet and giving nature from our mother. Mom was also a stickler when it came to neatness. She always kept us dressed sharp and smart, but her standards also extended to her surroundings. In our home, she made sure that we did our chores around the house. We had to make our beds every single day before we stepped out of the house with the clothes that needed washing, picked up from the floor, placed into the washing basket. General cleanliness was expected from every family member, young and old. Still, there was honestly say that mom loved us the same and he didn't favor one of us over the other. Our father, in many ways, the opposite of our mother, a talented artist who painted signs in and around the city of Louisville. He once told us that when he first began painting back in the early 1950s, there had been only one other black man painting all signs in a town. Initially, Dad started painting only in the black neighborhoods, but as time went on, as a result of word of mouth, requests for his services from the white community started to pour in, despite the fact that the town was segregated during that period. Even the pictures of Jesus Christ that hang in many of the churches in Louisville were painted by Dad. His name was stamped around the town. Muhammad and I were his biggest fans. We were always absolutely amazed at his paintings. We would watch him work his magic and just be blown away by the artistic talent. So much so that I wanted to grow up to be able to paint like him. He would be the inspiration of me to take up the art painting later in life. Even I don't think I ever quite reached this level. He told my brother, "You should become a lawyer or doctor." But in the end, of course, it was Dad's other talent that Muhammad would end up emulating over the course of his career. Besides his artistic leanings, Dad was a natural actor. And he loved to sing and dance. He had showman's pack and would emulate the stars of the time, practicing his vocals after work in the comfort of our home. Another thing he became known for was his flamboyant dress sense. The neat-looking, dark and handsome man would wear his freshly shone shoes, right tight pants and crisp laundered shirts, and hit the jazz clubs where he would dance until the early hours in the morning. He had this way of speaking very fast, as if he was in a rush to get his words out. "Cassius, slow your words down because I hardly understand what you're saying," Mom would say to him. Perhaps not appreciating that hearing our father rattle off words at 100 miles a minute would one day stand by my brother's career in such good stead. Muhammad and I always thought that our father could have pursued a career in showbiz, but he told us that the racial barrier kept him from making a success because opportunities for blacks just didn't exist at the time. Dad also unfortunately earned a reputation of drinking and being a ladies' man. He was a playboy, and Mom had to contend with his ways for much of her life. We would sometimes see our parents arguing, and Muhammad hated it. He would hide under the bed or cover himself up with a blanket. He would embrace me with affection, protective hug with both arms wrapped around his little brother. Nonetheless, they still loved each other, even if they were polar opposites as far as their personalities went. Unlike our mother, our dad was very stern, not one of those fathers who emanated a lot of affection. Worst of all, when he was drunk, he would often get into arguments and even get physical with our mother. By and large, he was a friendly man who endeavored to treat people right. But those moments had a lasting effect on Muhammad and me. And I think we both attempted to treat the women in our lives better because of them. One thing that both of our parents had in common was their faith. They were staunch Christians and followed the teachings of the Bible religiously. I remember how, without fail, Mom would dress me and Muhammad up on Sunday mornings to attend church to hear Reverend Wilson preach the gospel. Though she would shower us with love and affection at home, our mother wasn't the type to express her feelings openly in church by shouting and screaming like some of our fellow churchgoers. She was a quiet and peaceful lady in public, even if every little of that attitude rubbed off on her two boys. When Muhammad was a small child, he wouldn't sit still. He had what I'd guess you would call an itch, an urge to always be active. He would try to talk at every opportunity he got, even opening his mouth when there was no reason to do it. He would be eating, stuffing his face with food, and still saying to our mother, "I want more," at the age of 5. He would be playing with his neighborhood kids, standing on a platform like a leader, addressing a crowd, with me trailing after him just as fast as my 3-year-old body would allow. Our mom said she realized even then that my brother wasn't going to settle for being someone who would be lingering at the back. He was just destined to be the center of attention. Always going to be hard. He was loud, proud, and assertive. I came to think of him as a born leader, someone I would follow into almost anything. Mercifully, for two boys so set on diversion, we didn't have too many opportunities to get into serious trouble. We were very, very young. We stayed in the rough part of town in South Louisville until a couple of years after I was born, but then moved to the west end of the city with our grandparents for a very short while, before moving again just 4 blocks away in 1947 to 3302 Grand Avenue. This is the house that is now famous for being Muhammad Ali's childhood home. In the beginning, it was real rough where we were at, but there were worse places in the West End. Grand Avenue was, in some ways, considered upscale compared to most of the other places, most of the other areas close by. In the east end of the city, Smoketown was really bad, but none of the black neighborhoods in Louisville were as bad as the ghettos in the bigger major cities, where African Americans were restricted to certain areas of the city, where the population density was often more than 4 times greater than white areas, and where employment opportunities were often restricted. The neighborhood we grew up in was predominantly black, but there were some lawyers and doctors there, and we even had a few white families living alongside us. Still, I would like to debunk a myth that has somehow persisted for decades, that my brother and I had a middle-class upbringing. Although we weren't the poorest people in the neighborhood, there were others worse off. Most of our childhood in Louisville was spent in semi-poverty. That's the truth, and I know because we lived in it. Money was never easy to come by. There were plenty of times when we didn't even own a car. And when we finally did come by one, it was at least 10 years old. When it was inevitably in need of some good tires, Dad struggled to replace the old ones because of the cost. Our house, a bungalow, was a modest 2-bedroomed residence with a living room and a small dining area with a kitchen and bathroom. We had a small front yard and a very long backyard that extended from the back porch to an alley behind the house. There were several tall trees in the backyard, with a pond that had goldfish swimming in it. It was a bad place to live by any means, but there were still times when they couldn't afford to fix things in our own home and had to make to do as a result. For several years, for example, our roof and walls were in such a bad state that rain was able to get through them. The front porch had been on the brink of falling apart almost since the day we moved in. Dad did try to get it fixed, but there were always more pressing financial concerns. Even most of the clothes that Muhammad and I wore when we were younger came from Goodwill. We wore second-hand shirts and shoes that cost $1 or less. So, no, I wouldn't classify Muhammad's upbringing as a middle class at all. Though our father was a painter and our mother had a job cleaning for some white families, in many ways we were always trying our best to make ends meet. But still, our parents would always put food on the table. And while my brother and I may not have had much money, have been showered with gifts, or got everything we wanted, the fact that we had each other was typically enough to make us happy. Muhammad and I, for instance, shared a bedroom which was around 20 feet by 16. With his bed right next to mine, for some kids this might have been a chore, but for us, it just made us closer as brothers. He would have those late night talks with me until we just fell asleep. He would tell me that he had dreams and he wanted to grow up and be something in life. He would talk to me about one day becoming rich and famous. I remember he would tell me that he would buy our mother and father a big new house atop of the range Cadillac and have $250,000 in his bank account. More specifically, he said that the $250,000, always that number, would be saved so that if our family was in dire need, they didn't need to worry. Most people thought my brother's ambitions were far-fetched, but I had great conviction that Muhammad was the chosen one. I always knew he would make it big in this world. While Muhammad was daydreaming about the future he would make one day, of course, he never lost his sense of fun and humor that he became known for in his adult life. And it can be traced all the way back to when he was a young boy. More than anything, he got a thrill whenever he played a prank, endless variations on which he would happily devise for anyone he thought might fall for it. But certainly for me, in particular. One day he thought it would be a good idea to get me to squeal like a pig through a grandiose plan in which he tied a long string around the curtains in our parents' bedroom. To get my attention, he started pulling the string while he casually lay on his bed. "Hey Rudy," he said, "there's a ghost in our house." The next thing our parents knew, I was yelling and screaming, trying to wake them up with the news that there was a ghost in the house. Dad rushed to our room to see what all the screaming and shouting was all about. Obviously saw the ruse straight away. "Cassius Jr., will you stop playing tricks on your little brother Rudolph?" I remember him saying, still bleary-eyed for lack of sleep, and using my brother's full name to show his displeasure. Not that it would have discouraged Muhammad. "I tricked you really good, Rudy," he repeated. Doubled over the laughter, it could have almost been his catchphrase. Muhammad adored everything about our neighborhood. The neighbors were nice enough, and the general vibe was that of a close-knit community. But the best thing about it for him was that it afforded him endless opportunities of mischief and mayhem with a group of like-minded kids. My brother, as I've mentioned, was one of the leaders among the children, having risen to the top of that natural hierarchy that always occurs when enough kids get closer and together. I was his constant companion, but I would let him lead while I stayed in the background, hanging out at the front of our house or by the little restaurant round the corner. There was another corner where we would play games and shoot dice, a little farther from the watchful eyes of our parents. Of course, we would play with whatever toys our parents could afford to buy for us, but like most kids, we also made our own. We would convert broomsticks into horses by tying a piece of string around the top and putting it in between our legs, and then hollering at the top of our voices as we ran up and down the streets with no care in the world. And of course, like any growing boy at the time, our group of friends would play cowboys and Indians. Muhammad, having typically taken charge, was always adamant on being the cowboy and would always say that I had to be the Indian. Back then, cowboys were portrayed as the good guys, and the westerns, the Indians, were the bad guys. My brother always wanted to be a good guy because the good guys always won. That was fun and games. But even in the early days of our childhood, my brother and I were very competitive. We were close in age, so we would challenge each other in almost anything we pursued. Muhammad in particular strove to triumph in whatever game or competition he took part in. It made no difference whether it was racing, trying to see who could run the fastest, who could jump the highest, playing marbles or jacks, or hide and seek. Losing was simply out of the question. Pro wrestling was popular on TV in the 1950s, and our parents religiously watched it on TV. At least when the set in our house could be convinced to work. And so, of course, my brother would try to emulate the wrestlers on TV, usually at my expense. Sometimes the whole thing would get into a bit of boisterous as we were grappled in the living room, but it wasn't always one-sided affair. I always had a little more size on me when we were growing up. While he was a lot more skinnier and quite lanky, my brother wasn't really that interested in athletic pursuits until after he took up boxing. There were other kids who were physically more imposing than he was. Even if he was quick and competitive as far as sports were concerned, he never really enjoyed basketball or baseball, the games that almost every other boy in our age group wanted to play as often as possible. Across the street from our friend Adrian's house, there was a large plot of empty land which we would congregate on, and although Muhammad didn't really care much of any organized sport, he would take part sometimes just for the fun of it. He didn't take a shine to tackle football because, ironically, he felt it was just too rough. He didn't mind playing that football instead, and he was very good at running and elusive with it, twisting away from our efforts to tackle him the way he would one day dance away from the greatest fighters of his generation. And even when back then he was busting, the thrill of challenge just switched something on inside of him, and he would yell, "I'm too fast for you," even as he was sprinting away across the dirt. "There's no way you can catch me. Watch me score and touchdown." And thanks to his prodigious natural athletic talent, more than any love of the game, he would back up this confidence most of the time. Luckily, more often than not, Muhammad and I were on the same team, just as we would be through much of the rest of our lives. And those summer days growing up were very special and dear to our hearts. We were just innocent kids with boundless energy. Muhammad was always the life of the party and tried to inject a dose of enthusiasm into whatever he did. I, on the other hand, took things way too seriously, at least according to my brother. Though I was typically resigned to my role, I was 18 months younger after all. I sometimes let my frustrations get the better of me. Even then, things would rarely get physical. Our mom's quiet disapproval and dad's more hands-on discipline made sure of that. And for the most part, sibling rivalry was nothing but good for me. Muhammad wanted to be liked and appreciated. He had that in him right from the word go. Though always an attempt to impress others and stand out from the groups. There was, though, one area where I stood apart from my brother growing up, and as fate would have it, that was one that upset him the most. To put it simply, I always found it easy to talk to girls. It often surprises people, but when we were young boys, I was more of a ladies' man than my brother. I certainly started having girlfriends before he ever did. The girls in our neighborhood and school knew us both, and Muhammad would always be making eyes in their direction. He lacked confidence as far as approaching them and was absolutely petrified to ask them out. No matter how much he tried to conceal his bashfulness, it was always apparent. And as brash as he was, as radiant as his smile might have been, the occasional smile back was the closest he would get in flattering. For formative years, almost unbelievably, some girls actually perceived my brother as what you might now call a nerd. According to a few that I spoke with, it was because he didn't participate in football and basketball, the sports that were seen as being bad, at least in those preserve of the real men. It certainly wasn't the lack of looks, it was more to do with personality, which had its own stutters and stats behind all that bravado. And if anything, Muhammad's attempts to rectify the situation made matters worse. He would run alongside the school bus and call out the names of the girls and boys, and most of the girls would sink in their seats, embarrassed more for him than themselves. Muhammad, of course, couldn't stand the fact that I was getting the attention from the girls, and back then it was maybe the only thing that had a chance of driving a wedge between us as brothers. On the way home from school, for instance, I would usually get off the bus early to walk my girlfriend home and hang out with her at her house. The same scene played out more than once. We would be hanging out together only to hear a knock on the door and answer it and find my brother there. His face a picture of innocence. "Hey Rudy, Mom wants you to come home now. You're in trouble," would be the typical line. "She told me to get you and she wants you to come home right now." I, fearing for the worst, would apologize to my girlfriend and run back home, about 4 blocks in total. Thoughts rolling in my head about what I could possibly be in trouble for. "Mom, what's wrong?" I would ask as soon as we walked through the door, only to be met with a blank face and revelation that our mom, confused at the sudden appearance, didn't have the faintest idea what I was talking about. I'd fall for the scheme of Muhammad over and over again, with my brother repeating the charade whenever he got the itch. More than once, I accused him of being jealous. Couple of occasions, we exchanged a few words, and those days were really the only times in our childhood that I would really get mad at my brother. This wasn't a game he was going to beat me in. Only it must have stung him to see his little brother outshining him in one of the few areas he still didn't quite understand. And yet, however heated our words became, there was never a time in our entire childhood when we came to blows. No girl was going to seriously ruin our relationship. Whether we were chasing girls, playing touch football, or coming up with games of our own devising, our parents had one golden rule that was strictly enforced, and that was to be back at home before it got dark. This was pretty common. Back in those days, it wasn't out of the ordinary for kids to leave the house in the early mornings and roam the streets all day, not returning before dusk, getting up to whatever mischief they might throughout the day. Most people in our neighborhood didn't have the luxury of wearing a watch, but Dad's solution was simple. "Don't tell me you don't know what time it is. You'd better be home before the street lights turn on. Otherwise, you're in trouble." And so every night, a familiar scene would repeat itself. As soon as it started getting dark, street lights would start to come on, and we would race them all the way home. We wouldn't always make it. If we were late, we would be treated to a good old-fashioned spanking. The bathroom was a typical punishment chamber. Muhammad would always go first, leaving me to wait outside for Dad to call me after he would finish with my brother. Muhammad never really appreciated the harsh treatment Dad administered for lateness and other infractions. But our father had his own ideas on how things were supposed to be, and he had what you might call a zealous attitude to keeping us in check. A way of raising his voice and a mean look that would itch itself across his face that confirmed what was coming. More often than not, seeing that would make us straighten up. But by then, it would be too late. Rules were there to be obeyed, and our dad was going to make sure that we took heed. Perhaps because of this and a few other things, Muhammad's relationship with our father became somewhat distant before he left his teen. When I say this, I don't mean they had a big falling out, but the special bond that some fathers and sons are able to forge was lost before it could even begin. Contrary to what some biographers have written, though, I would never agree that our upbringing in Louisville had any element of what you would call physical abuse. First of all, Dad never intentionally tried to inflict unnecessary pain. Most of the time, Howard and I didn't even take note of this discipline because we would break the rules over and over again without giving much of a thought to the consequences. Of course, Dad disciplined us physically now and again, but in the 1940s and 50s, the practice was deemed necessary. Giving kids a strapping was certainly nothing out of the ordinary in black communities, especially when the consequences of stepping out of line could be so grave. In hindsight, Muhammad realized that Dad had the right intentions all along, and he came to terms with the fact that it was for our own good. It was dangerous being out late in our neighborhood especially, and whatever else was on his mind. Our father didn't want his kids to get caught up in the ugly scenarios that played themselves out on the streets nightly in our town. Even back then, there were drugs to worry about, as well as robberies and fights and brutal stabbings. And the father of two black boys, Dad had plenty of extra cause of concern. Furthermore, in 1950s, prejudice was spiraling out of control in parts of America. The violence instigated by the various racist groups that were creating trouble was particularly rife in the South, and the Louisville, it never felt far away. As young boys growing up, it very quickly became apparent to Muhammad and I that being black made us different. In our own town, the blacks endeavored to stay on their side of the town in a sort of semi-isolation. We didn't encounter much trouble in our own neighborhood, but elsewhere, our race was shoved in our faces all the time. Tensions were high, and the potential of trouble was never far away. One story in particular illustrates the kind of discrimination that was accepted as a fact of life during our formative years. When Muhammad was 8, Mom took him downtown only to bring him home with tears running down his cheeks. It turns out that he had wanted a drink and stood outside the store crying for water, except that it was a store that didn't serve blacks. Mom took him in and asked the shop assistant for a drink of water. Regardless, the woman, my mom told us later, was obviously afraid. She told Mom that she would lose her job if she served Negroes. He was an upset kid, gulping back tears and only asking for something to quench his thirst. And his mother couldn't even buy water in a store in his own hometown. In the end, the situation came to a head when the store's security personnel walked up to her and Muhammad and asked them to leave. In case the situation escalated, Mom was never a confrontational person, so she didn't make a big fuss. But that incident and others constantly reminded my brother and me that we were different, that we were effectively second-class citizens in our own town. Our race determined where we could eat, where our fathers could work, which parks we could play in, and how we could be treated if we broke the law. That stuck with me and Muhammad for a long time. Even though our mother looked almost white to both of us, she was still treated as colored in everyday life. And even when she came to terms with it, we would never be able to accept it. Muhammad in particular would often ask our parents why black people had to suffer. It was partly this climate that meant that even when we were in our teens, it was rare that Muhammad and I would venture too far from the West End on our own. We had been warned by our parents and by other members of the community and knew what could potentially happen even in a town as relatively enlightened as Louisville. The only real trouble we encountered was outside the vicinity of the West End. If we were in the wrong part of town, the all-white part, but still the fact that there was so little we could do never lost its sting. It wasn't uncommon for white boys in a car to pull up and howl at racial abuse. "Hey nigger, what are you doing here?" they would shout to us, trying to goad us into situations that could easily turn ugly. It always hit home, but my brother and I did our best to stay out of trouble, only too aware of the beatings and lynchings that were still occurring in places like Mississippi. The Deep South was another world, a world that our parents often brought to our attention, showing us pictures of Emmett Till's disfigured face when his killers were acquitted of murder, reminding us of what could happen if we were dared to retaliate, even in the face of hatred. And even though he had his own frustrations to take out in life, Muhammad never bullied anyone. I can attest to that. Yes, he had a boastful side of him, and he certainly had the physical skills to back up his word. But to my knowledge, no one ever said he bullied them or that he was a mean person in school or in our neighborhood. Moreover, I never saw him do wrong by anyone who didn't bring it on themselves. He was extremely close to me, so anywhere he went, you could bet your last dollar that you would see me with him. Our parents had made it clear to us at every step that we were to look out for each other whenever we were out of their sight. And Muhammad took pride in the fact that I was his little brother. He was very protective, and every kid around us was aware of the closeness we shared. They knew you couldn't mess with one brother. You had to mess with both of us. If somebody was going to bully Muhammad or trying to instigate trouble with him, even if I was certain to lose, I would jump in there and fight wholeheartedly. There was no way you could have fought my big brother without me involved. Muhammad would intervene if anyone tried to hurt me. We got in our fair share of scraps that way, but it wasn't until Muhammad was 12 years old that we discovered we might both just have a talent for it. I would like to thank each and everyone who has been listening in on the first part or the first chapter, which is my brother Muhammad Ali, the book. But this is the first part, which is called Brotherhood. And as you've listened, there's been a lot that has been said by Rahman Ali, the brother to Muhammad. And I can't take you guys any longer from this. I would just like to thank you once again and say that look out for the next chapter, which is going to be the dawn of a dream. And that will be coming to you next week. Once again, thank you very much for tuning in and listening. I would like to encourage you to subscribe so that you don't have to miss out on the next episodes that we're going to be producing. And for now, I'm just going to say I wish you all a very good morning, a very good afternoon, a very good evening. So long, everyone. From me, Mugerwa Black, I would like to say thank you once again. I'm out.